We're now going to take a look at the guidelines for drawing manga eyes. And as guidelines, they serve as a basic rule set that allows us to create an innumerable amount of manga-styled eyes from these basic rules. This is one of the most important modules in the entire course, and one of the most important lessons in the entire course. So please do take notes here, and let's get right into it. So the first thing we want to draw when we're drawing manga eyes, and we've marked out our eye location on the head, is we want to draw the upper lid line. And the upper lid line may curve to varying degrees, but it's important to note that it's typically darker than the rest of the lines of the eye, and it's typically pretty thick. So I'm going to just draw this in, and also drawing it in with multiple lines actually helps create the impression, if you're going for this type of look, of eyelashes. Speaking of the eyelashes, they're typically more horizontal than vertical with manga styled eyes. So here I'm just drawing them in kind of horizontally, not too vertical coming out, and probably not too many of them. By vertical I mean we don't want to do this type of thing. It's not to say you can't, but typically they're more horizontal than they are vertical. And once the upper lid line is in, we then add in the corner line. And this is the outer corner line. And this does not typically connect around the whole form. We never typically draw manga eyes with lines that kind of box the eye in. There is a lot of implied detail, as you'll see as we move forward. So in this instance, I'm going to create a nice little dynamic shape here. And it goes from thick to thin, thick at the top, thin at the bottom. And keep it nice and loose and rough. And we're going to draw in that corner. On the note of the eyelashes again, do note that they are underemphasized when you're drawing male characters. Whether you're drawing rounder style, large manga anime style eyes, or you're drawing the shorter type, whenever it's a male character, typically you want to underemphasize the eyelashes, unless there's some particular reason you want to have them in there. So we've drawn the top of the eye line, the upper eye line, and we've drawn the outer corner line. Next up, we're going to draw in the eyelid crease. Now, typically the eyelid crease is a short little line that appears on the inside area of the eye. And normally in real eye, we draw the eyelid crease something like that. And of course, there are manga styles where you do have the eyelid crease fully drawn in. But by far the most common is to have a short little eyelid crease like this at an angle on the inside area of the eye. Next, we can move to drawing in the iris shape. Now, the iris shape in manga can be very long and ovular, very big and circular, smaller and circular. It can take on a bulbous shape as well. You have an innumerable amount of options here. But effectively, you tend to want to draw a nice round and curved iris shape. So in this instance, I'm just going to put in an iris shape, let's say something like this. Let's make it a little bit bigger. And depending on the style you're going for, you can either have this top section cut off a little bit, or you can have the full roundness of the iris appearing underneath the upper eyelid line. In this instance, let's leave a top section cut off a little bit. Once the iris is done, it's not a bad idea to often thicken the lines of origin that come from the eyelid line. So you'll see here, I'm going to just add in some thickness here, just so that from a distance, it's very clear that there's almost an alluding to a shadow over the top of the iris. And of course there is, which is the upper lid shadow. We'll get to actually rendering that in just now. Now regarding the lower eyelid line, typically it's left out, or if it is drawn, it's drawn in as just a short line. In this instance, let's draw it in like this. That's not to say that you can't expand on the style, but typically speaking, it's generally a short line or it's left out. It's not even drawn in. And while we're talking about the lower eyelid line, we might as well talk about the tear duct area and the lower lid's inner section, which are also not really drawn in. If the inner lid is indicated, it's usually by an inner line, something like this. In this instance, I'm going to leave it out, but you can put that in if you want to indicate the inner line. And what happens really is that this becomes an implied detail, so that the viewer's brain kind of gets the information made up imaginatively, the differentiation between the skin area and the eye area. However, when manga is colored, the difference between the eye white and the skin is made clear with a color, but there is no actual line drawn there. Keep in mind, once again, these are guidelines for a baseline foundation for drawing manga eyes. And you'll see in the demos how we can totally expand on this to create tons of great varieties of eyes. Continuing on, once we've drawn in the pupil, once we've drawn in the iris, we can then draw in the pupil. And in this instance, I'm just going to draw a normal sized pupil here. And I'm actually going to move ahead and do some shading on this pupil. Just do some quick cross hatching. And let's also shade in our iris. Typically we want the iris to be shaded in somewhat lighter than the pupil. I'm using cross hatching here, but of course you can use actual shading, or you can use color fills on computer. And the eyes being shaded is quite important, even when you're dealing just with line art with a manga style. You can decide to do this later in the coloring phase, but the eyes actually have a whole lot of depth to them, and they're really worked on in excruciating detail to make sure that they read well and they read very clearly. So there really is a lot to manga eyes. Once we've got the shading down, we then want to put in the shadow of the lid. Now this doesn't always appear in every style, but it is a common trait. And so what we'll do is simply mark out a location here and then shade this area in. And this creates the impression of an eyelid shadow over the iris and over the eyeball. Sometimes in some styles, the pupil itself will actually bleed into the shadow area. So something like that. And it will take on the same shading. It'll be shaded as one single unit. But in this instance, we won't do that, but do keep that in mind. Next, we can put in our highlights. The highlights can typically appear anywhere. They can be partially in the iris and on the eyeball, partially in the iris and on the pupil, just in the pupil itself, just in the iris itself, and it can take on pretty much any shape. You can have triangular highlights, circular, square, rectangular, etc., etc. In this instance, let's put a large iris and eyeball highlight on the outside, and then we'll go ahead and put a smaller one on the inside. Now, expressions do modify this basic guideline design. And once again, let me re-emphasize, this is a basic guideline that we're using as a foundation to work from. All right, so you can certainly do this guideline eye as your anime character, your manga character's actual eyes, but I'd strongly encourage you to really take this guideline and start bending the rules a little bit. Let's now go over a summary of each of the steps once again, and I'll mark out these regions in red. The first thing that we want to do is to define our upper lid line and then our lashes, keeping in mind that they're typically horizontal. Keep in mind that this upper lid line can be long and curvy, it can be very round, it can have this type of look to it. You can really mess with the proportions a lot with this upper lid line. We then move on and we draw the corner of the eye. This may extend shorter, longer, very long, but we do want a corner in. You may have also seen manga styles that have the upper lid line and the lower lid line making this type of shape. That's totally fine as long as these two elements are in there. Once we've drawn that in, we then draw in the eyelid crease, typically at an angle. Remember, once again, that's not to mean that we can't do normal eyelid lines. You certainly can, but it's very typical to have a short indication of the eyelid crease. Next, we draw in the iris shape. This is usually quite large, but it can take many types of ovular shapes. It can be really big, it can be really small, it can be partially covered depending on the expression. We draw in the iris shape, and sometimes we will cut off the top of the iris and keep it flat, and other times, depending on the style, you may keep the entire iris shape round. This is quite important to remember, depending on the style. We then move in and draw in the pupil. The pupil itself can be very small. It can be gigantically large, again, depending on the look you're going for or your own custom style that you're building. Keep in mind that in certain styles, the pupil shape is linked to the iris shadow, the upper lid shadow. So you can link it in there, and you'll see in some of the demos that has been done. And then what we do is we move into doing the shading. And we want to make sure that the pupil is dark, is hopefully generally the darkest part of the inner side of the eye, and the eyelid shadow should be pretty dark as well. And then the iris itself should be at least darker than the ball of the eye, or the white of the eye. And then we move on and draw in our highlights. Just a point to note, remember that the lower lid line is usually quite short, if not appearing at all. That is up to you. Of course, you can extend a little bit longer, you can bend the rules. Take a look and see what you're able to achieve with the lower eyelid line, and if it matches the look and feel that you're going for. And once again, expressions do modify the base eye design, which we will be looking at further in the expressions section. I hope you've taken notes. This is your baseline foundations and steps for drawing convincing manga eyes, where we can elaborate on this basic design by changing the size, the spacing, and of course, some of the locations of the elements. That's in the lesson, and I'll see you guys in the next lesson.